Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. A jagged peak rising from the Alaskan wilderness, cloaked in perpetual fog and snow, where the wind howls like a tormented soul. The locals, the indigenous Aleut and Athabascan people, have whispered about it for generations. They call it Kinak, which in their tongue means the Forbidden One. Not because of avalanches or treacherous terrain, though those are plentiful, but because of something far older, something that defies explanation. Spirits, they say, guardians of the mountain who do not welcome intruders. And yet, in the dead of winter 2022, a detachment of U.S. Army soldiers was deployed there, to a remote outpost known only as Forward Operating Base Echo. Officially, it was for cold weather training and monitoring Russian activities in the Bering Strait. Unofficially, well, that's where the stories begin. Alaska has always been a strategic linchpin for the United States military. Since World War II, bases like Elmendorf, Richardson, and Eielson have dotted the landscape, guarding against threats from the north. But FOB Echo? It's not on most maps. Built in the late Cold War era on the slopes of Mount Kinak, about 200 miles northwest of Anchorage, it was meant as a listening post. Declassified documents from the 1980s reveal it was constructed despite protests from local tribes who warned of bad medicine on the mountain. Archaeological surveys turned up ancient burial sites, petroglyphs depicting shadowy figures, and unexplained seismic anomalies. The army dismissed it as superstition. But soldiers who've served there, they tell a different tale. I've spent years collecting these accounts from veterans, men and women who've stared down IEDs in Afghanistan and patrolled the DMZ in Korea. They're not the type to spook easily. Yet, when they speak of FOB Echo, their voices drop, eyes darting as if expecting something to listen in. These are first-hand testimonies, pieced together from emails, interviews, and declassified reports. What happened on that forbidden mountain wasn't just the cold or isolation playing tricks. It was something in the barracks, whispers in the walls, shadows that moved on their own, and a presence that turned hardened warriors into believers in the unseen. Tonight, we'll dive into one such deployment, through the eyes of Sergeant Elias Thorne, a 15-year veteran of the 4th Infantry Division and his squad. Their mission was routine: secure the base, run drills, endure the Arctic night. But the barracks, those old Quonset huts buried in snow, they held secrets that no amount of MRRs or M4 carbines could fend off. As we proceed, ask yourself, what would you do if the enemy wasn't flesh and blood, but something that haunts the very ground you stand on? Let's begin. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Forbidden Peak. I remember the helo ride-in like it was yesterday. My name is Sergeant Elias Thorne, call sign Ghost, 15 years in the infantry, most recently with the 4th Infantry Division out of Fort Carson. We'd been tagged for a 3-month rotation to Forward Operating Base Echo on the slopes of Mount Kinak, Alaska. The mission brief was straightforward: cold weather survival training, enhanced reconnaissance along the Bering Strait approaches, and baseline monitoring of Russian naval activity pushing closer to U.S. waters each season. Nothing glamorous, just another Arctic grind. But the name Kinak had already started circulating in the barracks backstateside. The indigenous communities, Aleut elders, Athabascan guides, called it the Forbidden One. They didn't elaborate much when the outgoing unit asked. They just shook their heads and said the mountain didn't like company. The Black Hawk bucked through the final approach, rotors fighting 40-knot gusts that carried ice crystals like shrapnel. Through the side door I could see the peak rising sharp and black against a bruised sky, its upper flanks lost in swirling white. Below us the terrain was a frozen mosaic. Snowfields, broken by dark stands of black spruce and alder. Then the sudden vertical rise of granite. No roads reached this far. The only way in or out was air, or a brutal overland trek most wouldn't survive. Captain Reyes's voice crackled over the intercom as the bird flared for landing. "Listen up. Temperatures bottom out at -50. Winds will try to rip your face off. And forget the ghost stories you heard at Carson. We're here to train, not chase folklore. Secure the perimeter, run the drills, and keep your heads in the game." The squad gave the expected nervous laughs. Me, Corporal Diaz, Private First Class Harlan, Specialist Jenkins, and the rest of our 8-man fire team. We'd all done hard places before. Helmand Province, the Korean DMZ in winter. A remote Alaskan outpost wasn't supposed to rattle us. The helo settled onto the scraped helipad, a narrow ledge at roughly 4,000 feet elevation, and the doors slid open. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing breath and burning exposed skin in seconds. We moved fast, hauling rucks, weapon cases, and crates of MREs and Arctic gear down the short ramp while the crew chief kept the bird spooling. Within minutes, the Black Hawk lifted away, leaving us in a sudden, oppressive silence, broken only by the wind moaning through the pines. FOB Echo looked exactly like the satellite photos. A tight cluster of 1970s-era Quonset huts half buried in perpetual snowdrifts, linked by shovelled paths and chain-link fencing topped with razor wire that sagged under ice. Diesel generators thumped in their insulated sheds, sending blue exhaust curling into the grey. The main barracks was the largest structure, a long, low, corrugated steel tube painted faded olive drab. We filed inside, boots squeaking on salt-crusted linoleum. The air smelled of old fuel oil, mildew, and something faintly metallic I couldn't place. 20 bunks lined the walls, most still made up from the last rotation. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, throwing harsh light across scarred metal lockers, and a communal table littered with outdated field manuals. "Home, sweet home," Diaz said, dropping his ruck beside the nearest rack and kicking snow off his boots. He tried for levity, but his voice echoed too loudly in the empty space. We spent the first hours in routine, inventory, weapons maintenance, generator checks, setting up the TOC in the adjacent hut. Harlan, our youngest at 19, was assigned first radio watch. Around 0200 he keyed the internal net. "Sarge, you feel that?" I was already half out of my sleeping bag, M9 on the shelf above my rack. "Feel what, kid?" "Like someone's watching us. From the corners." I stepped over to his position. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the heaters and the occasional pop of contracting metal. The empty bunks across from us looked untouched, shadows pooling under them. "Altitude, fatigue, and bad coffee," I told him. "Get some rack time when Jenkins relieves you." He nodded, but his eyes kept flicking to the far end of the Quonset. I tried to sleep. The scratching started around 0300, faint at first, like fingernails dragging slowly along the outer steel skin. Not random, rhythmic, almost deliberate. I sat up, listening. The sound paused when I moved, then resumed the moment I lay back down. No rodents up here. The biologists had told us the ecosystem was too harsh. I swept the room with my flashlight. Nothing. The squad was dead to the world, breathing steady. I told myself it was wind-driven ice scraping the hut. I told myself a lot of things that first night. Morning brought PT on the slope behind the perimeter, burpees in full ECWCS, ruck carries up a 30-degree incline until lungs burned and legs shook. Afterward, we ran a short recon patrol to familiarize ourselves with the ridgeline. That's when I saw the first petroglyphs, a cluster of boulders half covered in snow, etched with elongated humanoid figures surrounding a triangular peak. The shapes had no faces, just hollow eyes and outstretched arms. One carving showed smaller figures being pulled downward into the mountain itself. I took photos with my phone, told myself it was historical curiosity. Back at base, the oddities piled up quietly. To CO2 detectors chirped false positives. The satellite phone glitched, filling the speaker with bursts of static that almost sounded like voices speaking in a language none of us knew. Reyes ran diagnostics and blamed solar activity. During evening chow, Diaz opened his locker to find his personal effects rearranged. Letters from his wife, a photo of his daughter, all stacked in perfect order when he swore he'd left them scattered. "Who's screwing with my stuff?" he asked the room. No one answered. Eyes darted, but no one confessed. That night the scratching returned, louder, closer, as if it had moved inside the walls. I lay still, tracking the sound as it travelled the length of the Quonset, pausing at each bunk like it was counting us. Then came the whisper, soft, unmistakable, right against my ear, even though no one was near. "Leave, or join us." I came off the rack fast, pistol in hand, sweeping the room. The barracks door stood ajar, snow drifting across the threshold in fine white lines. We had dogged it shut at lights out. I'd checked it myself. Wind couldn't have moved that latch. I secured it again, threw the bar, and stood there listening. The scratching had stopped. The whisper didn't repeat. But the cold that settled into my bones had nothing to do with the temperature outside. We were alone on that mountain. Or so we thought. Something had already noticed our arrival, and it was waiting to see how long we would stay. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. The second week felt like the mountain was testing our resolve, seeing how much we could take before something cracked. I'm still Sergeant Elias Thorne. And these are the details I wrote down in the small notebook I kept inside my ECWCS jacket. Notes I didn't trust to the official log because they sounded insane even to me. The weather turned brutal fast. A low-pressure system parked itself over the Bering Strait and refused to move, dumping snow in horizontal sheets and dropping the wind chill to -70 at night. Patrols became shorter, more cautious. We stuck to the ridgeline trails we'd already broken and avoided the steeper north face where the cornices looked ready to carve. Inside the barracks, the diesel heaters fought a losing battle against the cold, seeping through every rivet and seam in the old Quonset. We kept the place at 68 degrees, but it never felt warm. The chill lived in the walls. Private First Class Harlan started having trouble sleeping. He'd wake up sweating despite the temperature, claiming he heard footsteps pacing the length of the hut after lights out. "Not boots," he said one morning over lukewarm coffee. "Bare feet. Slow." like someone walking on the snow outside but inside my head at the same time. I pulled him aside after morning formation. "You're 19, Harlan. First long winter deployment. The mind plays tricks. Altitude, circadian disruption, the dark. It all stacks up. You need to compartmentalize." He nodded, but his eyes kept drifting to the ventilation grates along the ceiling. "I know what I heard, Sarge. It wasn't wind." That afternoon, we ran a maintenance sweep on the perimeter sensors. While we were outside, the generators hiccuped. Once, twice, then steadied. Back inside, the lights dimmed to a dull red glow before snapping back. In that momentary darkness, I caught movement at the far end of the barracks. A tall, indistinct shape standing between two empty bunks. Not shadow, not reflection. It had shoulders, a head, but no definition, like smoke given just enough form to stand upright. I blinked, and it was gone. The cold spot it left behind lingered on the floorboards. My boot soles felt it when I crossed the room. "Contact!" Diaz called from his rack, sitting up fast. "Negative," I answered, voice flatter than I intended. Just the lights flickering. Generator surge. He didn't look convinced. Word spread quietly after that. Over MRs that evening, Jenkins brought up the old base law he'd heard from a mechanic who'd been through Echo in 2015. They say in 87, a whole rifle platoon disappeared for 2 days. No comms, no tracks, nothing. When they finally walked back in from the ridgeline, they were barefoot, half frozen, and wouldn't talk about where they'd been. Just kept repeating that something had pulled them underground. Reyes shut it down hard. That's ghost story bullshit, recycled from every remote post since the Cold War. Focus on the mission profile. We've got sensor calibration tomorrow and a 12-mile ski loop the day after. Save the campfire tales for when we're back at Carson. But the whispers didn't care about chain of command. They started faint, barely audible over the generator drone and the constant wind battering the hut. By the third night, they were clear enough that more than one of us heard them. Not English, not Russian. Something older, throatier, with clicks and drawn-out vowels that reminded me of the few Aleut phrases I'd looked up after seeing those petroglyphs. Our field recorder picked them up during a routine radio check. Low, overlapping voices murmuring the same 3 syllables over and over. Later, when we had intermittent satlink, I ran the audio through a translation app. It came back fragmented. Anak, intruders. Drive out. Mother. The word for mother in Aleut. The mountain calling to something maternal, protective, and angry. The walls themselves began to feel wrong. Not just cold, contracting, expanding, as if the Quonset were breathing in slow motion with the temperature swings. At 0301 morning, the sound came from directly behind my bunk. A slow scrape, metal on metal, travelling the curve of the corrugated wall inches from my head. I pressed my palm against the steel. It vibrated faintly, like a distant engine, but the generators were on the far side of the compound. I sat up, swept the beam of my headlamp around the room. The squad slept on. Chest rises steady, faces slack. The scraping paused when the light hit the wall, then resumed the moment I turned away. I traced it with my fingers. No loose panels, no exposed wiring. Just cold, pitted metal that shouldn't have been moving at all. Then the voice, singular this time, close enough that the hairs on my neck stood up. Thorn. My name. Clear as if Diaz had spoken it from the next bunk. But Diaz was 15 feet away, snoring softly. I came off the rack, boots on the floor, before I even realized I'd moved. Pistol in hand, I cleared the length of the barracks twice. Nothing. No one awake. No drafts. No open vents. When I got back to my rack, the voice came again. Softer, almost conversational. Stay and see. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat against the wall, weapon across my lap, listening to the scratching circle the hut like a predator sizing up prey. At dawn, the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The squad woke, grumbled through morning routine, none of them mentioning anything unusual, but Harlan looked at me across the table during chow and asked quietly, "You heard it too, didn't you, Sarge?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because whatever was in those walls wasn't done with us yet. It had learned our names, and it was starting to talk back. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. The second week felt like the mountain was testing our resolve, seeing how much we could take before something cracked. I'm still Sergeant Elias Thorne, and these are the details I wrote down in the small notebook I kept inside my ECWCS jacket. Notes I didn't trust to the official log because they sounded insane even to me. The weather turned brutal fast. A low-pressure system parked itself over the Bering Strait and refused to move, dumping snow in horizontal sheets and dropping the wind chill to -70 at night. Patrols became shorter, more cautious. We stuck to the ridgeline trails we'd already broken and avoided the steeper north face where the cornices looked ready to carve. Inside the barracks, the diesel heaters fought a losing battle against the cold seeping through every rivet and seam in the old Quonset. We kept the place at 68 degrees, but it never felt warm. The chill lived in the walls. Private First Class Harlan started having trouble sleeping. He'd wake up sweating despite the temperature, claiming he heard footsteps pacing the length of the hut after lights out. "Not boots," he said one morning over lukewarm coffee. "Bare feet, slow, like someone walking on the snow outside but inside my head at the same time." I pulled him aside after morning formation. "You're 19, Harlan. First long winter deployment. The mind plays tricks. Altitude, circadian disruption, the dark. It all stacks up. You need to compartmentalize." He nodded, but his eyes kept drifting to the ventilation grates along the ceiling. "I know what I heard, Sarge. It wasn't wind." That afternoon, we ran a maintenance sweep on the perimeter sensors. While we were outside, the generators hiccuped. Once, twice, then steadied. Back inside, the lights dimmed to a dull red glow before snapping back. In that momentary darkness, I caught movement at the far end of the barracks. A tall, indistinct shape standing between two empty bunks. Not shadow, not reflection. It had shoulders, a head, but no definition, like smoke given just enough form to stand upright. I blinked, and it was gone. The cold spot it left behind lingered on the floorboards. My boot soles felt it when I crossed the room. "Contact!" Diaz called from his rack, sitting up fast. "Negative," I answered, voice flatter than I intended. "Just the lights flickering. Generator surge." He didn't look convinced. Word spread quietly after that. Over MREs that evening, Jenkins brought up the old base law he'd heard from a mechanic who'd been through Echo in 2015. They say in 87 a whole rifle platoon disappeared for 2 days. No comms, no tracks, nothing. When they finally walked back in from the ridgeline, they were barefoot, half frozen, and wouldn't talk about where they'd been. Just kept repeating that something had pulled them underground. Reyes shut it down hard. That's ghost story bullshit, recycled from every remote post since the Cold War. Focus on the mission profile. We've got sensor calibration tomorrow and a 12-mile ski loop the day after. Save the campfire tales for when we're back at Carson. But the whispers didn't care about chain of command. They started faint, barely audible over the generator drone and the constant wind battering the hut. By the third night, they were clear enough that more than one of us heard them. Not English, not Russian, something older, throatier. With clicks and drawn-out vowels that reminded me of the few Aleut phrases I'd looked up after seeing those petroglyphs. Our field recorder picked them up during a routine radio check. Low, overlapping voices murmuring the same 3 syllables over and over. Later, when we had intermittent satlink, I ran the audio through a translation app. It came back fragmented. Arnak intruders. Drive out. Mother. The word for mother in Aleut. The mountain calling to something maternal, protective, and angry. The walls themselves began to feel wrong. Not just cold, contracting, expanding, as if the Quonset were breathing in slow motion with the temperature swings. At 0301 morning, the sound came from directly behind my bunk. A slow scrape, metal on metal, travelling the curve of the corrugated wall inches from my head. I pressed my palm against the steel. It vibrated faintly, like a distant engine, but the generators were on the far side of the compound. I sat up, swept the beam of my headlamp around the room. The squad slept on, chest rises steady, faces slack. The scraping paused when the light hit the wall, then resumed the moment I turned away. I traced it with my fingers. No loose panels, no exposed wiring, just cold, pitted metal that shouldn't have been moving at all. Then the voice, singular this time, close enough that the hairs on my neck stood up. Thorn. My name, clear as if Diaz had spoken it from the next bunk. But Diaz was 15 feet away, snoring softly. I came off the rack, boots on the floor, before I even realized I'd moved. Pistol in hand, I cleared the length of the barracks twice. Nothing. No one awake. No drafts. No open vents. When I got back to my rack, the voice came again, softer, almost conversational. Stay and see. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat against the wall, weapon across my lap, listening to the scratching circle the hut like a predator sizing up prey. At dawn, the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The squad woke, grumbled through morning routine, none of them mentioning anything unusual. But Harlan looked at me across the table during chow and asked quietly, "You heard it too, didn't you, Sarge?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, because whatever was in those walls wasn't done with us yet. It had learned our names, and it was starting to talk back. The next night, it got worse. The whispers weren't random anymore. They called out individual ranks, nicknames, even fragments of conversations we'd had earlier that day. "Diaz, your daughter waits." "Jenkins, the scar on your ribs still burns." "Harlan, you should have stayed home." Each one landed like a gut punch, precise and personal. We stopped talking about it openly, fear of feeding it, or maybe fear that saying the words would make them real. But the tension thickened the air inside the Quonset until it felt hard to breathe. During a midnight watch, I caught the silhouette again. This time, it didn't vanish when I turned the light on it. it simply stepped backward into the shadows between the lockers and dissolved, leaving behind the faint smell of wet earth and pine needles, impossible scents in a sealed metal tube buried under snow. I swept the area, found nothing but a thin film of frost on the floor that hadn't been there an hour earlier. We were still 2 months from rotation out. The storm showed no sign of breaking, and every night the voices grew a little clearer, a little closer, like they were moving from the walls into the room itself. Whatever guarded Mount Kinnack had decided we weren't just visitors anymore. We were trespassers, and trespassers, it seemed, had to be dealt with. Chapter 3. Shadows Among Us. By the second month, the barracks no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a cage we'd walked into willingly, and the thing that lived there was slowly turning the lock. I'm Sergeant Elias Thorne again, and these memories are harder to write down because they stop being just strange and start being personal, start costing us. Corporal Diaz disappeared on a Tuesday, not during a patrol, not on some exposed ridgeline where a whiteout could swallow a man whole. He vanished inside the compound. Between the mess hut and the barracks, a stretch of cleared path, maybe 30 yards long. 1 minute he was stepping out to grab a spare battery pack from the supply shed. The next, his radio went silent mid-sentence. "Hey, Sarge, I'm just static. Be right." Then, nothing. We tore the place apart. 8 men sweeping every hut, every snow berm, every vehicle bay. Thermal images showed cold metal and colder snow. No heat signatures. Footprints ended at the door of the supply shed like he'd stepped through a wall. We found him 4 hours later, curled in the back corner of that same shed, door latched from the outside. Body temperature down to 93 degrees. No frostbite yet, but his lips were blue, and he was muttering non-stop. "They showed me," he kept saying as we carried him to the aid station. "The dead soldiers are buried right under the floorboards. They're waiting for us to join them." Medics got him stabilized, rewarming blankets, warm fluids, and we medevaced him out on the next bird that could fight its way in. Official report read, "Acute environmental stress reaction with dissociative episode." The kind of sanitized line that lets everyone sleep at night. Before they loaded him, though, Diaz grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were clear for the first time in days. "Sarge," he whispered, "the barracks is on graves, Aleut graves. The shamans put a curse on the ground when the army took the land in 78. They moved the bones, but they didn't move the watchers. They're still here, and they're pissed." I didn't have an answer for him. I just nodded and watched the helo lift into the swirling white. That conversation lit a fuse, and I pulled every declassified file I could access over the patchy SAT-link. Construction records from 1978 confirmed it. During grading for the main Quonset Foundation, crews unearthed skeletal remains. Adult males buried with carved walrus ivory and obsidian points. Artifacts consistent with pre-contact Aleut warrior interments. The army relocated the site quietly, reinterred the bones 20 miles south with minimal ceremony, and classified the incident as cultural resource mitigation. No mention of protest from local elders. No mention of the petroglyphs they'd bulldozed to make room for the helipad. Just paperwork. After Diaz left, the squad started sleeping in shifts. Never alone in the barracks, if we could help it. Harlan took to keeping his bayonet fixed under his pillow. Jenkins strung chem lights along the ceiling beams like he was warding off something. I didn't mock them. I couldn't. The shadows started showing themselves in daylight. First, it was peripheral. Dark shapes that slipped around corners when you turned your head. Then they lingered. I saw one standing at the foot of my bunk during morning shave, tall and thin, arms too long, head tilted like it was studying me. When I spun around, it was gone, but the mirror still held a faint outline of frost where its reflection should have been. That night we had our first physical contact. I was on watch at 0200 when the barracks shook. Not an earthquake, not the wind. A single deliberate jolt, like something massive had struck the foundation from below. Lights flickered, then darkness. In the black, I felt pressure on my left shoulder. Heavy, a cold fingers digging in. I swung my flashlight up and around. Nothing. But when I looked down, 4 distinct bruises were already blooming through my base layer, purple against skin, shaped exactly like a handprint. "Get off me!" I snarled into the empty room. The pressure released. The lights came back on. Across the aisle, Harlan sat bolt upright, eyes wide. "You felt it too?" I asked. He nodded. "It whispered my mom's name. Then it laughed." We called a squad huddle at 0400. Reyes listened without interrupting, then spoke low. "We're not leaving early. Evac request gets denied in this weather anyway. But we treat this like a hostile environment. Double watches, no one moves alone, weapons stay loaded and on safe, and we document everything. If this is some kind of mass hallucination, fine. We'll laugh about it later. And if it isn't..." He let the sentence hang. "That patrol we found the tracks. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, clean slate. On the lee side of the ridgeline, away from our usual routes, we discovered a line of prints. Elongated, narrow, 5-toed, but too long for human feet, too narrow for bear. They led straight to a crevasse we'd marked as off-limits, then stopped at the edge like whoever or whatever had simply stepped off into the void. No rope, no gear, no body below." Reyes stared at the prints for a long minute. "Geological anomaly," he said finally. "Snow melt pattern, wind sculpting. We're heading back." No one argued. That evening the voices returned, but they weren't whispering anymore. They spoke in normal tones, overlapping, coming from every direction at once. "Thorne, you brought them here. Diaz is gone, but he sees. Harlan, your mother still prays for you. Reyes, you cannot command what is older than command." We traced the sound to the ventilation shafts. I volunteered to crawl in with a headcam and a handheld light. The duct was tight, dusty, lined with ancient wiring. 30 feet in, I found a small access panel, never marked on any blueprint, behind which was a cavity maybe 4 feet square. The walls were rough stone, not metal, and carved with the same elongated figures from the petroglyphs outside. In the center of the floor lay a single object, a child's mitten, wool, frozen solid. Dates from the 1980s by the style. Something moved behind me, fast, deliberate. I backed out so quickly I scraped skin off both elbows. When I emerged, the squad was waiting, faces pale. "Did you see it?" Jenkins asked. "No," I said, "but it saw me." The mountain had stopped warning us. It was communicating, and every message carried the same subtext. You were never supposed to be here. The longer we stayed, the more it would remind us why. We still had 6 weeks left on the rotation. The storm showed no sign of lifting. and the shadows in the barracks were no longer content to watch. They were starting to reach. Chapter 4. The Unearthed Secret. The third month arrived like a sentence being carried out. We were past the point of pretending this was just another deployment. The barracks had become a pressure chamber, every creak and whisper tightening the screws. I'm Sergeant Elias Thorne, and what follows is the part of the story where we stopped reacting and started digging, literally, and everything changed. Harlan broke first, openly this time. We found him at first light outside the perimeter fence, on his knees in fresh powder, clawing at the snow with bare hands until his fingers bled. His ECWCS gloves lay discarded a few feet away. When we reached him, he was sobbing, breath fogging in violent bursts. "They're under here," he kept repeating. "The forbidden ones. They're waiting for the floor to give way so they can pull us down." We hauled him back inside, restrained him on a bunk with 550 cord for his own safety, and got fluids into him. Medics wanted him on the next bird out, but the storm had locked the skies again. No rotary wing could fly in 60-knot gusts with visibility down to 20 feet. Harlan stared at the ceiling, lips moving silently, as if continuing a conversation none of us could hear. His ramblings stuck with me. Under here. I couldn't shake the image of those petroglyphs, the elongated figures dragging smaller ones into the mountain. During the next quiet window, I pulled Reyes aside in the TOC. "Sir, we need to look beneath the barracks." Harlan's not the first to say it. Diaz said the same thing before he left. "There's something in the substructure. Maybe a void. Maybe old construction we don't have on the prints." Reyes rubbed his temples. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in days. None of us had. "You want to cut into the floor of a 60-year-old Quonset in -40 weather. I want ground-penetrating radar first. We've got the kit for seismic surveys. If it shows nothing, we drop it. If it shows something, we need to know what we're sleeping on." He stared at me for a long beat. "1 scan. Quick and clean. No excavation unless I give the word." We set up the GPR unit in the center aisle that afternoon. Antenna dragged across the linoleum on a sled while Jenkins ran the monitor. The screen lit with cross-sections of soil and rock beneath the foundation. Most of it was predictable. Compacted gravel, permafrost layer, native bedrock. Then, at about 8 feet down, directly under the middle of the barracks, the return changed. A sharp, rectangular anomaly, hollow, man-made, edges too clean for natural void. Metallic signatures pinged inside it, small and dense, and running from the anomaly toward the north wall, a narrow linear feature that looked suspiciously like a sealed tunnel entrance. Reyes studied the printout. Old Cold War bunker, probably a fallback comms room or ammo store from the 70s build. Not on the current blueprints. Figures. "Or it's older," I said, "and they built the barracks over it without knowing." He didn't argue. "We go in, controlled breach, document everything. If it's just rust and forgotten MREs, we seal it and move on." Access was through a rusted floor hatch in the utility closet, never used, welded shut since the 80s by the look of it. We burned through the welds with a cutting torch, pried the hatch open, and dropped a ladder into darkness that smelled of damp concrete and something older, like whetstone and decay. Reyes went first, then me, then Jenkins with the camera. The space below was a low-ceilinged chamber, maybe 10 by 15 feet, lined with corroded metal sheeting. 4 rusted cots lined one wall. On a small table sat a stack of mouldy journals stamped OSS Classified, Office of Strategic Services, World War II vintage. The entries were handwritten, faded but legible. 1944, Mount Kinnack listening post established. Entities observed after first seismic charges. Ethereal forms, hostile to intrusion. 2 men lost to madness. Recommend immediate abandonment. Another page. The Kinnack spirits guard ancient relics buried beneath the peak. We disturbed the seal. They do not forgive. Deeper in the stack, a final entry dated 1945. Last man standing. They are in the walls now. If anyone finds this, do not dig further. The mountain remembers. We were still reading when the air pressure changed. Thickened, grew heavy like before a lightning strike. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Whispers swelled from the stone, are no longer faint, no longer in a layout, now in English, layered, angry. Blasphemers. The lights on our headlamps flickered. Shadows rushed in from the corners, tall, smoke-like forms with 2 long limbs. I felt hands, dozens of them, cold and insistent, tugging at my sleeves, my belt, my ankles. Jenkins yelped as something yanked his camera strap. Reyes shouted, "Fall back! Up the ladder! Now!" We scrambled out, slamming the hatch behind us. The moment it closed, the pressure released, but the cold lingered. Upstairs, the barracks was chaos. Lights shattered in their fixtures, shards raining down, bunks overturned, gear scattered like a grenade had gone off in the middle of the room. No one had been inside while we were below. Jenkins sat on the floor, holding his arm. 4 parallel scratches through his sleeve, shallow but bleeding. "It was angry," he said. "We woke it fully." Reyes ordered the hatch welded shut again, double thick steel plate over it. We posted a permanent guard on the utility closet. But that night the barracks came alive in ways it hadn't before. Doors slammed on their own. Objects lifted off tables and smashed against walls. The whispers became shouts. Names, accusations, promises of what would happen if we didn't leave. At 0300, the entire structure shuddered again, harder this time. Dust sifted from the ceiling seams. Harlan, still restrained on his bunk, began to laugh. A low, broken sound that didn't belong to him. "They're coming up," he said. "Through the floor, through the walls. They want to show us what's waiting." We were trapped. No evac possible for at least another week. At the unearthed secret wasn't just history. It was a door we'd cracked open. And on the other side, something ancient had been waiting a very long time for company. Chapter 5. Descent into Madness. The final weeks on Mount Kinnack were no longer a deployment. They were a siege. The mountain had declared war, and we were the last holdouts in a fortress that had turned against us. I'm Sergeant Elias Thorne, and these are the days when the line between what we could explain and what we could only survive began to dissolve completely. The unearthed chamber beneath the barracks had become a wound that refused to close. Even though the hatch was welded shut and covered with a steel plate, the cold seeped up through the floorboards like blood from a fresh cut. The whispers no longer stayed in the vents or the walls. They filled the entire Quonset, a constant low murmur that rose and fell like breathing. At night they spoke our names in rotation, as if taking attendance. Captain Reyes was the first to see a full manifestation in daylight. It happened during morning brief at 0900. We were gathered around the table, plotting the last ski patrol we'd attempt before the final evac window. Reyes paused mid-sentence, eyes fixed on the far end of the barracks. We followed his gaze. A figure stood there, translucent but solid enough to block the light from the window behind it. It wore faded World War II-era fatigues, olive-drab wool with sergeant stripes on the sleeves. The face was blurred, like a photograph left too long in water, but the posture was military, hands behind the back, head tilted slightly as if listening. It didn't move. It simply watched. Reyes's voice cracked, the first time any of us had heard it do that. "That's the one from the journals, the last man standing." The apparition raised a hand slowly, palm out, then pointed directly at the welded hatch in the utility closet. Then it faded, leaving only a lingering chill that frosted the nearest window in seconds. No one spoke for a long minute. Jenkins finally broke the silence. "We need to get off this rock, sir, before it decides we're part of the permanent party." Reyes shook his head. "Evac's still 48 hours out at best. Weather's holding, we hold position, we hold discipline." But discipline was fraying fast. Harlan's condition deteriorated. The medics had him on light sedatives, but they didn't touch whatever was happening inside his head. He spoke in two voices now, one his own, soft and scared, the other deeper, older, with an accent none of us could place. "The Watchers have been patient," the second voice would say while Harlan's lips moved. "But patience has limits. The mountain remembers every boot that treads its skin." We stopped letting him sleep alone, 2 men on him at all times. The poltergeist activity escalated. MRE wrappers lifted off the table and spun in tight spirals. A rifle, Jenkins's M4, rose from its rack, chambered around by itself, and fired into the ceiling. The round punched through the corrugated metal and kept going. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. It could have been. Radios began broadcasting on their own. Dead air broken by voices reciting fragments of our own conversations from days earlier. "They're under here," Harlan's recorded voice echoed through the speaker. "The forbidden ones." Then laughter, low, wet, not human. One night during a blizzard that rattled the Quonset like artillery, we lost comms mid-patrol. The squad got separated in whiteout conditions. I ended up in a snow cave I dug against a boulder, waiting out the worst of it. I heard footsteps circling outside, slow, deliberate, crunching through the drifts. When the wind died enough for me to emerge, the rest of the squad was already back at base, claiming I'd been the one leading them through the storm, guiding them back with hand signals. I hadn't left the cave for 3 hours. Each man told the same story. They'd seen me, or something wearing my shape, beckoning them through the white. When they reached the barracks, I wasn't there. I was still out in the snow. That was the moment paranoia set in fully. We started sleeping in shifts. Had weapons close, eyes on each other as much as on the shadows. The climax came at 0200 on our second-to-last night. The barracks lights died completely. No flicker, no warning. Total black. Then the temperature plunged. Frost formed on the walls in minutes. We grabbed headlamps, but the beams barely cut 10 feet before the light scattered like it was hitting fog. From every corner, shadows detached from the walls and floor. Tall, elongated figures, the same shapes from the petroglyphs. They formed a loose circle around our bunks, moving in slow, synchronized steps. The whispers became a chant, words in Alut that rolled through the room like thunder trapped in a bottle. I felt the air thicken around my throat, cold fingers pressing in. Visions flashed in my mind, soldiers from 1945 screaming as they were dragged beneath the snow. Aleut warriors from centuries ago standing guard over a sealed cavern. Our own faces, pale and lifeless, added to the watch. "Fight it!" I shouted, voice hoarse. "Form up! Soldiers' creed! Now!" We fell into line instinctively, back to back, weapons up even though there was nothing to shoot. We'd recited the creed in unison, voices shaking but steady. "I am an American soldier. I am a warrior and a member of a team." The chant faltered. The shadows recoiled slightly. "I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values." The pressure on our throats eased. The cold retreated a fraction. "I will always place the mission first. I will never accept a defeat." The figures began to dissolve, melting back into the walls like smoke sucked into vents. "I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade." By the time we reached the end, the lights flickered back on. The frost receded. The shadows were gone. We stood there, breathing hard, weapons still trained on empty space. Harlan looked at me with clear eyes for the first time in weeks. "It's not over," he whispered. "It's waiting for the next rotation." We evacuated 36 hours later. The bird came in low through a brief break in the storm. We boarded without ceremony, leaving FOB Echo exactly as we found it, except for the welded hatch, the frost marks on the walls, and the silence that felt heavier than any wind. I still hear the whispers sometimes, not every night. Just when the wind picks up outside my house in Colorado, or when I'm alone in the dark. They don't call my name anymore. They just say one word, soft and patient. Chapter 6. The Last Watch. The evacuation window was 48 hours away, but time had already stopped feeling linear. Every hour stretched, every minute compressed, as if the mountain itself was deciding how long we could be allowed to breathe its air. I'm Sergeant Elias Thorne, and these are the final days when we learned that survival isn't always about fighting. It's sometimes about enduring what refuses to let you go. We abandoned the lower half of the barracks. The welded hatch in the utility closet had begun to frost over from the inside, condensation beading on the steel plate like sweat on fevered skin. At night we heard tapping from below, slow, methodical, like fingernails counting down. No one volunteered to check it. We moved our sleeping area to the far end near the main door and kept a rotating guard of 3 men awake at all times. One on the hatch, one on the perimeter windows, one on the squad itself. Trust had eroded to the point where we watched each other almost as closely as we watched the shadows. Reyes tried to keep routine alive. Morning PT became mandatory again. Push-ups and burpees on the cleared floor space, breath fogging in thick clouds under the flickering fluorescence. But halfway through the second set, the lights would dim without warning, and the cold would rush in from the floor vents like water flooding a compartment. We'd stop, form a defensive circle, weapons up, reciting cadence louder than necessary until the temperature stabilized. It became our ritual. Physical exertion as defiance, voices raised as ward. The manifestations grew bolder. They no longer hid in corners. They walked the aisles between bunks during daylight hours. Tall, blurred figures in outdated uniforms. Faces obscured, but postures unmistakably military. One appeared behind Jenkins while he was cleaning his rifle. He felt the breath on his neck before he saw it reflected in the receiver. When he spun, the figure was already retreating, dissolving into the wall, leaving behind the distinct scent of wet wool and gun oil. Odours that shouldn't have existed in our sealed, heated space. Harlan's dual voice had become constant. The older tone spoke prophecies now, calm and certain. "The Watchers do not kill quickly," it said through his mouth while his own eyes filled with tears. "They collect. They wait until the soul is ready to join the god. Then they take the body last." We stopped sedating him. The drugs only made the second voice louder, angrier. Instead, we listened when he spoke, hoping for some clue, some way to appease whatever we had disturbed. One afternoon, the sat phone connected long enough for a burst transmission to higher headquarters. Reyes sent the strip. "Environmental anomalies escalating. Recommend immediate extraction. Personnel exhibiting signs of severe psychological stress." The reply came back clipped. "Weather window remains 48 hours. Hold position. Maintain operational security. No questions, no concern, just orders." That night, the barracks door, triple locked and barred, opened on its own at 0330. Snow blew in horizontal, carrying the howl of the wind. We rushed to secure it, but before we reached the threshold, a figure stepped through from the outside. Not one of the smoke-like Watchers. This one was solid, corporeal, wearing ECWCS, identical to ours. Hood up, face shadowed. It walked straight down the centre aisle, boots leaving wet prints on the linoleum that steamed in the warmth. It stopped at Harlan's bunk, reached down, and placed a single object on his chest. A child's mitten. The same one I'd seen in the hidden chamber weeks earlier. Harlan's eyes snapped open. The older voice spoke once, clear and final. "She has been waiting longer than you." The figure turned and walked back out into the storm. We followed, Reyes first, me right behind, into the whiteout. The tracks led 20 yards to the perimeter fence, then stopped. No body, no sign of struggle. Just the mitten, now resting on the snow where the prints ended, pristine and unfrozen. We brought it inside. Harlan cradled it like a relic, rocking slowly. "She was the last one left behind," he said in his own voice. "In 87. They never found her. She's been calling the others home ever since. We didn't sleep after that. We sat in full battle rattle, lights on max, reciting anything we could remember. Ranger Creed, infantry school cadences, childhood prayers, anything to fill the silence. The tapping beneath the floor grew faster, more insistent, like a heartbeat accelerating. At 0500, the entire structure groaned, a deep, metallic sound like steel plates shifting under pressure. Cracks spidered across the concrete foundation. Dust fell from the ceiling seams. The hatch in the closet began to bow inward, the welds popping one by one like gunfire in the distance. Reyes ordered everyone to the main door. "We're bugging out on foot if we have to. Rally point is the helipad. Move!" We grabbed rucks, weapons, the bare essentials. Harlan refused to leave the mitten. He tucked it inside his jacket and followed. As we reached the door, the lights died again. Total black. Then a single voice, not layered, not whispering, spoke from every direction at once, calm, almost maternal. "You may go, but the mountain keeps what it claims." The door opened without resistance. Outside, the storm had broken for the first time in weeks. Stars visible overhead, wind dropped to a murmur. The path to the helipad was clear, snow packed hard underfoot. We moved out in tactical formation, weapons hot, eyes scanning every shadow. Nothing followed. No apparitions, no whispers. Just silence. Profound, unnatural silence. The bird arrived at first light. We boarded without looking back. As the Black Hawk lifted, I watched FOB Echo shrink below us. The cluster of half-buried huts, the welded hatch now visible from above like a scar, the ridgeline rising sharp behind it. Mount Kinnack stood unchanged, indifferent, eternal. We landed at Elmendorf. Debriefs were clinical. Environmental stressors, mass suggestion, possible carbon monoxide exposure. No mention of the mitten. No mention of the voices. Harlan was separated for psych eval. The rest of us were given leave. I still have the audio recordings on a thumb drive I never turned in. Sometimes, late at night, I play them. The whispers are still there, faint but clear. They don't call names anymore. They just repeat one phrase over and over, patient as stone. We'll see you when the snow falls again. Chapter 7. Echoes that remain. We made it out. The Black Hawk touched down at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson just after dawn on a morning that felt stolen from the mountain. The rotors wound down, the doors opened, and we stepped onto concrete that didn't creak or whisper. Medics met us on the pad, standard post-Arctic protocol, checking vitals, drawing blood, asking the same questions they ask everyone who spent too long in the cold. We gave the answers they expected. Fatigue, mild hypothermia symptoms, psychological strain from isolation. No one mentioned the mitten. No one mentioned the voices that had learned to speak our language. The paperwork would call it environmental exposure and operational fatigue. The chain of command would sign off. Life would move forward. Except it didn't. Harlan was separated immediately for extended psych evaluation. At last I heard he was at Walter Reed, under observation, still clutching that child's mitten like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The doctors wrote delusional disorder with shared psychotic features. I visited him once before they transferred him further east. He looked thinner, eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks, but when he saw me, he smiled in a way that wasn't entirely his own. "They let me keep it," he said, nodding toward the mitten on the bedside table. "They think it's a comfort object, but she's still with it. She's waiting for the next person who sleeps under that roof." I didn't argue. I just sat with him until visiting hours ended. The rest of us scattered on leave. Diaz went home to Texas to see his daughter. Jenkins disappeared into the mountains of Colorado. Said he needed elevation to clear his head. Reyes requested reassignment stateside. Rumor was he didn't want anything north of the lower 48 ever again. I went back to Fort Carson, tried to slip into routine, PT, range days, family time. But the quiet was wrong. Too clean. No wind moaning through pines. No metallic scraping behind the walls. And at night, when the house settled, I waited for the whispers that never quite came. They waited for winter. The first snow in Colorado fell in late October. That night, I woke at 0300 to the sound of fingernails on glass. Slow, deliberate, tracing the outline of the bedroom window. I sat up, heart rate spiking the way it had on the mountain. Nothing there, just frost-forming patterns on the pane. Elongated figures, arms outstretched, surrounding a triangular peak. I wiped the window clear. The frost returned the next night and the next. I stopped looking. The recordings stayed on that thumb drive in my safe. I never played them again after the first time back home. But one evening, alone in the garage, I plugged it into my laptop. The file opened clean, no corruption, no static. The voices were still there, layered and patient, reciting the same phrase they'd left us with on the helipad. "We'll see you when the snow falls again." I shut it off. I haven't opened the drive since. FOB Echo was officially closed 6 months later. Satellite imagery showed the site abandoned, huts still standing, fence still up, but no heat signature, no movement. A small engineering detachment went in the following summer to dismantle what they could before winter locked it again. They found the barracks intact, the welded hatch undisturbed, but every interior surface was covered in a thin layer of frost that hadn't melted despite the July heat. No explanation. They torched what they could, bulldozed the rest into the slope, and left. The mountain took the rubble back quickly. I still get emails from the others, sporadic and careful. No one talks about it openly. Too many psych evals, too many career risks. But the questions are always the same underneath the small talk. Have you heard anything? Seen anything? Dreamed of the peak? The answers are always no. But we all know we're lying. Mount Keenack remains on restricted access maps, listed as Environmental Hazard Zone, former training site. Locals still won't go near it. The Aleut elders who once protested the base construction have never said, "I told you so." They don't need to. They've been saying it for generations. I keep a single photograph from the deployment on my desk. Not one of the petroglyphs or the barracks, but a simple shot I took from the helipad on our last morning. The ridgeline rising sharp against a sky finally clear of storm. In the foreground, half buried in snow, sits the mitten. I didn't remember taking the picture. The camera timestamp says I did. Sometimes I look at it and wonder if we really left anything behind, or if we simply traded places with whatever had been waiting in those walls. The snow is falling again tonight, heavy, wet flakes sticking to the window. I can hear the wind picking up outside, carrying that familiar low moan. I don't open the curtains, I don't check the frost. I just sit in the dark, listening, because I know, deep in the place where instinct lives and reason doesn't reach, that the mountain hasn't forgotten us. And when the snow falls heavy enough, when the wind howls just right, it will call again. Not in anger, not in threat, in invitation. Welcome home.